On a crisp autumn afternoon, the sun poured through the glass walls of Los Angeles International Airport's Terminal 4, casting long golden streaks across the polished floor. Aaliyah Morgan sat near Gate 47, her camera balanced on her lap, the lens cap dangling by a thin cord. She wasn't just another teenager killing time before a flight. This trip to Boston was the first step toward a dream she had been nurturing for years. She wore a light gray hoodie with the sleeves pushed up to her elbows, black jeans, and a pair of well-worn Converse sneakers. Her carry-on sat by her feet, the front pocket slightly open to reveal the edge of her sketchbook and a set of gel pens. Slung across her chest was her most prized possession, a Canon EOS R6 with a 50mm prime lens. It wasn't the latest or the flashiest, but she knew how to coax light and shadow into stories with it. Her father, David Morgan, had bought her first camera when she was 12, after noticing she spent more time photographing the family dog than playing games on her phone. Since then, her weekends had been filled with early morning shoots at farmers markets, portraits of friends in natural light, and countless experiments with framing and perspective. Photography wasn't just a hobby, it was her language. Today's destination was Boston, where she'd been accepted into a semester-long program at the Massachusetts College of Art and Design. It was a place she had only read about in magazines, a place where her heroes, photographers whose work hung in galleries, once studied. Her father insisted she travel in comfort. The ticket, printed on thick cardstock, felt almost ceremonial in her hand. Horizon Air, Flight 212, Los Angeles to Boston, Seat 2A, First Class. She'd argued for economy, or at most premium economy, but David had waved her off with a smile over breakfast. 9 hours in a cramped seat will drain you before you even unpack your camera, he'd said. Consider it an investment in your work. Aaliyah glanced up from her thoughts, her eyes catching the movement at the boarding podium. A middle-aged woman with a severe blonde bob stood behind the counter, her spine straight as a ruler. Her name tag read Susan Whitaker. The woman's smile, when she offered one, was tight and quick, gone before it reached her eyes. Aaliyah watched as Susan dealt with a man in a rumpled polo shirt who was juggling a coffee and his boarding pass. "Sir, as I've already explained, your seat is confirmed. You're just in the wrong boarding group," Susan said, her tone clipped. When the man muttered something under his breath, Susan's eyes sharpened like glass. "We follow the process here. That's how everyone gets where they need to go." A few minutes later, a young woman with a large backpack approached. Susan barely glanced at her before declaring, "That bag's too big. You'll have to check it. $50 fee." No offer to measure it, no attempt at a solution. From her seat, Aaliyah felt a twinge of unease. She had seen people like Susan before, people who carried their authority like a blunt instrument, ready to use it on anyone they thought wouldn't push back. Ethan Brooks, a junior gate agent with kind eyes and a slight hunch to his shoulders, stepped up beside Susan. He was quietly restocking boarding passes, occasionally murmuring to passengers with a tone much softer than his colleagues. Every so often, he glanced at Susan as though gauging whether he needed to step in or stay out of the way. Aaliyah tried to focus on her journal, jotting down quick notes about the light in the terminal, the pattern of travelers' footsteps, the faint scent of espresso drifting from the Starbucks kiosk nearby. But the sense of being observed didn't fade. Every time she looked up, Susan's eyes seemed to find her, traveling from the hoodie to the camera to the first-class ticket peeking from her notebook. When the first-class boarding announcement finally came over the PA system, "Now welcoming our first-class and priority passengers," Aaliyah closed her journal and slipped it into her bag. She stood, adjusting the strap of her camera bag, and stepped into the short line that had formed near the podium. Ahead of her, a man in a tailored navy suit finished a phone call and handed over his boarding pass. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Roberts," Susan said, her voice suddenly syrupy, almost deferential. He smiled, thanked her, and stepped toward the jet bridge. Then it was Aaliyah's turn. She moved forward, passport in one hand, ticket in the other. "Good afternoon," she said with a polite smile. Susan's eyes flicked from Aaliyah's face to her outfit, then down to the boarding pass. Her brows knit together for the briefest moment before she picked up the ticket with 2 fingers, as though testing its authenticity by touch. "Seat 2A?" she asked, her tone flat but edged. "Yes, that's correct," Aaliyah replied. Susan's gaze lingered on her for a beat too long. She turned to her computer, typing something with sharp, staccato keystrokes. Ethan shifted slightly, his eyes darting from Susan to Aaliyah, then back down to his work. Behind Aaliyah, the line of first-class passengers was growing. She adjusted her grip on her passport, acutely aware of the silence between the keyboard clicks. Susan looked up again, her smile gone. "Please wait a moment," she said. "I need to verify something." The tone wasn't friendly, and it wasn't optional. It was the kind of tone that said, "I don't think you belong here." Aaliyah's heartbeat ticked up a notch. She glanced at the boarding door just beyond the podium, the start of the journey she'd been dreaming of for years, and then back at Susan, who was now scanning her screen with narrowed eyes. Ethan cleared his throat softly. "Susan, maybe—" Susan held up a hand, cutting him off without looking away from the monitor. "I'll handle it." The line shifted impatiently. The hum of the terminal seemed to fade, replaced by the sound of her own pulse in her ears. This was supposed to be the easy part: hand over the ticket, find her seat, and take off toward a new chapter. But standing under Susan Whitaker's cold gaze, Aaliyah had the sinking feeling that this chapter was going to begin with a fight she hadn't planned for. The short walk from the waiting area to the podium felt longer than it should have. Aaliyah could hear the shuffle of shoes behind her, the faint drag of a rolling suitcase, and the low murmur of passengers talking among themselves. But all she could really focus on was the woman waiting at the counter, her arms resting stiffly on either side of the boarding scanner like a gatekeeper carved from stone. Susan Whitaker's eyes were fixed on her before Aaliyah even reached the podium. It wasn't the kind of look you give someone you're about to welcome aboard. It was a look that weighed, measured, and quietly disapproved. Aaliyah set her passport and ticket on the counter. "Good afternoon," she said again, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. Susan picked up the boarding pass, her gaze flicking from the printed name to Aaliyah's face, then down to the hoodie and sneakers. Her mouth pressed into a thin line. "Seat 2A, first class?" she asked, though the words carried the tone of, "Are you sure about that?" "Yes," Aaliyah replied. She kept her tone polite, careful not to bristle. Susan scanned the ticket, her brow furrowing slightly as the green light confirmed it was valid. But instead of handing it back, she angled the pass between her fingers, turning it like she was inspecting a counterfeit bill. "Traveling alone?" she asked. "Yes," Aaliyah said. Susan's lips twitched upward, not into a smile, but something closer to a smirk. "And how old are you?" 17. The smirk widened. "Interesting. That's quite a ticket for someone your age." Behind her, the line of passengers shifted. A man in a gray blazer craned his neck to see what was holding things up. A woman with a Louis Vuitton carry-on glanced at her watch and sighed loudly. Aaliyah resisted the urge to look back. "My father purchased it for me," she said evenly. "Did he now?" Susan tapped the ticket against the counter in a slow, deliberate rhythm. "May I ask when this was purchased?" Aaliyah blinked. "Yesterday morning." Susan's eyes sharpened. "Last minute, first class, high value." She said it like she was reciting bullet points from a case file. "We've been dealing with a lot of fraudulent bookings lately." "I'm aware," Aaliyah said, keeping her voice calm. "But this ticket is not one of them." Susan leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper that still carried enough volume for the next passenger to hear. "Honey, maybe you picked up the wrong ticket by mistake, or maybe your father booked it without realizing the cost." The honey landed like a pinprick under the skin. It was patronizing, dismissive, and deliberately so. "No," Aaliyah said, her tone firming. "This is my ticket. I know exactly what it cost." Susan let out a quiet, humorless chuckle. "Well, I'm not convinced, and until I am, you won't be boarding." Ethan Brooks, stacking boarding envelopes at the side of the counter, looked up. "Susan, maybe we should—" "Ethan," she cut him off without turning her head. "Please focus on the standby list." The man in the blazer shifted impatiently. "Is there a problem here?" "No problem," Susan said quickly, though her voice held the kind of false cheer that signaled the opposite. She returned her gaze to Aaliyah. "Do you have proof of purchase? A receipt? A credit card statement?" Aaliyah's jaw tightened. "The ticket is right there in your system. That's proof." Susan straightened, and her voice cooled another few degrees. "The system can be fooled, and as the lead agent on this flight, I'm responsible for who gets on board. I'm not comfortable letting you on without further verification." "That's ridiculous," Aaliyah said before she could stop herself. "Ridiculous," Susan echoed, her brows lifting as if the word were a personal affront. "You're holding up the line for legitimate passengers, Miss Morgan." And then, with a deliberate slowness that made the moment stretch unbearably, Susan held the boarding pass up between both hands. Her fingers curled. The rip was small but sharp, like a paper cut in the air. The two halves of the ticket fluttered onto the counter, and for a second the entire gate area seemed to pause. Conversations went silent. The hum of the terminal faded. Aaliyah stared at the torn paper, her pulse thudding in her ears. Susan pushed the halves toward her. "Now, if you'll please step aside. I have other passengers to board." Ethan froze, his mouth opening slightly before he shut it again, his eyes darting between Susan and Aaliyah. The passengers behind her were watching openly now, some with frowns, others with raised brows. Aaliyah didn't move. She didn't pick up the torn ticket. She didn't look away. Then she reached into her hoodie pocket, pulled out her phone, and pressed the first name on her favorites list. The line clicked. "Hey, Angel," her father's voice came through, warm and familiar. "Aren't you supposed to be in the air by now?" "Dad," she said, keeping her voice steady, "I have a problem at the gate." "What kind of problem?" She looked straight at Susan, her tone cooling into something solid. "I think you should talk to the lead agent here." There was a pause. Then her father said with quiet authority, "Put me on speaker, right now." From a glass tower in downtown Seattle, rain beaded on the windows and slid in thin lines, turning the city into soft watercolor. Inside the Horizon Air boardroom, the light was cool and even over a long walnut table scattered with laptops and neatly stacked briefing packets. David Morgan stood at the head of the table mid-sentence when his personal phone vibrated once and flashed a name he never ignored. He didn't take personal calls during operational reviews, ever, but seeing Aaliyah on the screen changed the rule he'd written for himself years ago. He raised a finger to pause his team, answered, and walked toward the window. "Hey, Angel," he said, that easy warmth in his voice, like he'd just stepped into their kitchen. "Aren't you supposed to be in the air by now?" The boardroom faded for him as Aaliyah explained, measured, steady, each word a frame in a scene she would have rather never shot. He listened without interrupting. When she reached the part about the rip, he closed his eyes for half a second. "Put me on speaker," he said quietly. "Right now." Back at Gate 47, Terminal 4, LAX. The air felt dense, as if the entire terminal had leaned in. Aaliyah tapped the speaker icon and held out the phone, arm steady. "This is the lead agent," Susan said, chin lifted, voice clipped. "Is this Ms. Susan Whitaker?" David's voice didn't rise. It never needed to. It filled the space without shouting. A flicker crossed Susan's face. "Who's asking?" "David Morgan?" The name landed in the air with an almost physical weight. Ethan looked up sharply. A few passengers exchanged glances. Some already had their phones half raised, like they'd sensed a story forming long before any of them knew the characters. "I'm Aaliyah Morgan's father," David continued. "I'm also the person who purchased her fully paid, non-refundable first-class ticket on Horizon Air Flight 212. I'd like to hear your official reason for denying boarding and destroying her boarding pass." Susan's mouth tightened. She held the line like it was a tug-of-war rope. "Mr. Morgan, we have to be vigilant. There has been fraud. The booking was last minute. She's a minor. I made a judgment call for the safety and integrity of this flight." "Safety?" David's tone cooled a degree. "What specific safety concern did you identify in my daughter's person, documentation, or conduct?" Susan glanced at the growing line, as if support might appear there in the faces watching her. "I don't have to disclose our internal security indicators to you. It stopped being internal when you staged the accusation in public," David said, "and when you tore up a valid boarding pass. Aaliyah, please hold the phone toward your left." Aaliyah angled the phone toward the jet bridge entrance. 2 pilots had just come off the bridge, one in her late 40s with 4 silver stripes on her shoulder boards and a face that carried calm like a skill. The captain. She'd clearly been on her way to check paperwork or stretch her legs before pushback. "Captain," Aaliyah said, gentle but clear, "my father would like a word if you have a minute." The captain stepped closer, reading Aaliyah's posture faster than any explanation. "Captain Linda Harper," she said into the phone, professional and steady. "What's happening here?" "Captain Harper," David said, "apologies for pulling you in. Your lead agent just denied boarding to my daughter, Aaliyah Morgan, seat 2A, on the grounds of an alleged fraud profile, then tore up her boarding pass. I'm asking 2 things. First, hold this flight. Second, connect me with your LAX station manager immediately." Captain Harper didn't ask who he was. The cadence of authority told its own story. Still, procedure mattered. "Sir, holding a departure is significant." "I agree," David said. "Please check your crew manifest for 2A and your corporate directory for my name. I'll wait." Captain Harper gave a single nod to Aaliyah, then stepped to the side and tapped into her tablet, eyes scanning. Her finger paused on the first-class manifest. "Morgan, Aaliyah." She swiped to the corporate directory, typed in David Morgan, paused again, and felt the horizon of the situation widen beneath her feet. She looked up, met Susan's gaze with something new in her expression, quiet assessment, and then addressed Ethan. "Ethan, get me the station manager on radio. Michael Torres, priority." Ethan moved like he'd been waiting for instruction he could finally follow. "Operations, Gate 47, priority call for station manager Michael Torres. Code. We'll call it an executive escalation." Passengers weren't pretending not to watch anymore. The woman with the Louis Vuitton bag lowered it to the floor, phone already recording at chest level. The man in the blazer leaned out of line for a better angle, and from 2 rows over, a man in a tweed jacket with a press badge tucked behind a transit pass watched, eyes sharp. Thomas Grant registered details for a living. He wasn't reaching for the story, but the story had reached for him. Susan smoothed her blazer lapel and leaned toward the phone. "Mr. Morgan, we can resolve this quietly. If you'll just give me a moment to—" "To what?" David asked. "To print the ticket you tore? To unsay what you said in front of 30 witnesses?" A breath of silence, the kind that happens right before a summer storm when the leaves turn their pale undersides toward the sky. The radio at the counter crackled. "Gate 47, Torres." "Mike," Captain Harper said, taking the handset from Ethan. "We need you at 47 now. Executive escalation. Name attached, David Morgan." The pause on the other end was a heartbeat too long to be casual. "On my way," Torres said, already moving. Somewhere beyond the windows, a baggage cart hummed by with a rattling crate. The terminal clock ticked toward departure time. The space between those ticks felt wide enough for a reckoning. "Ms. Whitaker," David said, the warmth gone from his voice now, replaced by something flat and precise. "While we wait for management, how many passenger complaints are on your file from the last 24 months? Susan blinked. "Excuse me?" "I'll save you the effort," David said. Paper rustled faintly near his end of the call, someone in Seattle sliding a report across the table. 12. 3 cite discriminatory language. 1 references tearing documents. Is any of that inaccurate? Color rose into Susan's cheeks. For a moment her eyes darted toward Ethan, as if the numbers might dissolve there. They didn't. Those were misunderstandings. she said tightly. "People try to game the system all the time. And you saw my daughter as one of those people before you saw her as a person," David said. "Aaliyah, is security present?" Aaliyah glanced to the side. 2 uniformed airport officers had materialized at a respectful distance, not summoned by drama, but by experience. Terminals have their own radar for when a situation tilts. "They're here," she said. "Thank you," David said. "Captain, I'm going to ask that you hold boarding until your station manager arrives. No door closure." Captain Harper nodded once and signaled with 2 fingers to the flight attendants near the jet bridge. "Stand down." She wasn't grandstanding. She was stabilizing. A minute later, less, Michael Torres jogged into view, tie slightly skewed from the hurry, tablet tucked under his arm. He took it in fast, the crowd, the captain on deck, Ethan's pale focus, Susan's stiff jaw, Aaliyah's steady posture, and the phone. "Michael Torres," he said, breath controlled, reaching for the device as Aaliyah offered it. "Mr. Morgan, station manager at LAX, I'm here." "Mr. Torres," David said, "you have 60 seconds to explain how a lead agent under your supervision felt empowered to publicly profile a black minor and destroy her boarding document while invoking security. While you consider your answer, know this. My legal team is listening, and so is corporate communications. 30 seconds. Torres's throat worked once. He hated "I didn't know," and he hated excuses more. "Sir," he said, "I won't tell you I understand how that felt for your daughter because I don't. I will tell you this shouldn't have happened to anyone. It is not our standard, and it is mine to fix. Effective immediately, Ms. Whitaker is relieved of duty pending termination. I will personally reissue Ms. Morgan's boarding pass and escort her to her seat. We will also document every step of this incident for your review." Susan's head snapped toward him. "Michael, Ms. Whitaker," Torres said, voice firm without heat, "please remove your badge and place it on the counter." She stared at him for a beat that held all the pushback she had left. Then she reached up, unclipped the plastic holder with the Horizon logo, and laid it down. The sound was small. It carried. "We'll talk about process," Torres said, "but not here and not now. Officer, please stand by to escort Ms. Whitaker off the sterile side after we complete initial statements." "On it," one of the officers said evenly. David's voice returned, the temperature dropping another degree. "Ms. Whitaker, I am sorry for what brings us here, but not for the consequence. Mr. Torres, 2 more items. First, the delay is coded under ground disruption management, not crew. Second, Captain Harper will hold door until Aaliyah is seated. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Torres said. "Understood and confirmed." "Captain Harper," David said, his tone softening a notch, "thank you for stepping in. Please take care of my kid until I can get to her in Boston." Captain Harper's mouth tilted in a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes yet. "Always, sir." "Angel," David said finally, the steel in his voice easing back into the warmth it knew best. "You good?" Aaliyah let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "I'm good, Dad." "You did everything right," he said. "I'll call you when you land. Hand the phone back to Mr. Torres." She did. Torres listened, nodded once or twice, then ended the call and handed the phone back with both hands, as if returning something more fragile than glass. "Ms. Morgan," he said, meeting Aaliyah's eyes, "I am sorry. I know that's not enough, but it's the first thing. We will fix this." "Thank you," Aaliyah said. She didn't rush to fill the space. She didn't need to. Torres turned to Ethan. "Reissue for 2A, first class immediate. Escort Ms. Morgan through. Captain, we'll reset boarding once she's seated." "Yes, sir," Ethan said, already pulling up the PNR. His fingers moved faster now, steadier. The printer chattered, and a fresh, pristine boarding pass slid into the tray like a small white flag after too much noise. He tore it cleanly along the perforation and, without thinking, squared the corners before handing it to Aaliyah with both hands. "Ms. Morgan," he said, voice low but clear, "welcome aboard." She took it and felt a strangely tender sting in her chest. Not triumph, something quieter, like a camera shutter closing on a shot she hadn't wanted to take but needed to get right. Captain Harper stepped forward. "Walk with me," she said, not as a command but as a promise. As they moved toward the jet bridge, the crowd opened. Someone murmured, "Good for her." Someone else said, "About time." A few phones lowered, as if collectively agreeing the ending made recording feel unnecessary now. Thomas Grant didn't lower his eyes. He wasn't gawking, he was witnessing. He watched Aaliyah's chin, the set of her shoulders, the way she held the boarding pass, not like a trophy, but like an ID she'd had all along. He made a note in his head and none on his phone. Later he'd ask permission. Now he just watched the truth finish arriving. Near the threshold, Aaliyah paused and looked back, not at Susan, who stood several steps away with her arms crossed tight against her blazer, face drained to a porcelain shade, but at Ethan. He gave a small nod. She returned it. Two people who would remember the same afternoon from two different sides of a counter and meet in the middle anyway. Inside the jet bridge, the air was cooler, tinged with that metallic airplane scent of filtered air and possibility. Captain Harper walked half a step ahead, then slowed to match Aaliyah. "What you experienced," the captain said, voice low enough to stay between them, "was wrong. Not in a vague, we could have done better way. In a precise way. I'm sorry. On behalf of the crew, and frankly, as a person." "Thank you," Aaliyah said. She glanced down at the boarding pass. The black ink was crisp. It looked like all the other boarding passes she'd ever held, which was both ordinary and remarkable. They stepped into first class. The purser looked up, David, according to the nameplate on his vest, and his expression shifted the way a sky does when a cloud moves and sun breaks through. "Ms. Morgan," he said, his voice like velvet with structure, "we've been expecting you. May I take your coat?" He noticed the hoodie and corrected with an easy pivot. "Or perhaps your bag." "I'm okay," she said softly. "Thank you." "Water? Ginger ale?" he offered, already half-turning. "Ginger ale would be great," she said. "Right away." Captain Harper gestured to 2A. Aaliyah stepped into the small private world of the seat. Side table, blanket still shrink-wrapped, the faint hum that quieted the outside noise enough to feel like a reset button. Before she sat, she turned back. Through the cabin door, she could still see a sliver of the gate. Ethan printing something else, Torres speaking quietly into a radio, Susan now flanked by an officer, not dragged or paraded but escorted, a final sentence in an old chapter. Captain Harper followed her gaze. "We'll push as soon as you're settled," she said. "No rush." Then, in a tone that sounded like the absolute center of her job, "You're safe here." Aaliyah nodded and sank into the seat. For a moment, her hands rested on the armrests the way she did before a big test, grounding, steadying. She reached into her bag, not for her phone, but for her camera. She lifted it, turned it on, and aimed out the window. On the apron below, a baggage handler in a neon vest waved a bat in a lazy arc. The light hit the tarmac at an angle that made everything look outlined. She pressed the shutter. The click was soft and final. This, she thought, is how I remember it, by choosing the frame. In the galley, David the purser set a glass of ginger ale on a small tray and wrote a quick note on Horizon stationery. "We're glad you're here." He signed it with his first name and slid a tiny wings pin onto the corner. Up front, Torres returned to the podium with the weight of 100 small course corrections settling into his spine. He stood beside Ethan. "We'll reset," he said quietly. "We'll do the announcements together. We'll mean them." Ethan nodded, throat tight. Torres turned to Susan. "Ms. Whitaker," he said, not unkindly, not kindly either. "Officer Keller will accompany you to badge control. HR will contact you with next steps. I'm sorry for how this is happening. I'm not sorry that it is." Susan's chin wobbled, the first crack in a steel mask that had been years in the forging. "I did my job," she said softly, and even she didn't sound convinced. "You did a job," Torres said. Not the one we need." She looked past him to where Aaliyah had disappeared down the jet bridge. For half a second, something like understanding flickered in her eyes. Too late to change the scene, not too late to register its shape. Then she turned and walked with the officer, spine still straight, because old habits don't break all at once, even when the ground shifts. Torres exhaled and looked at the clock. He picked up the handheld mic. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. We'll begin boarding momentarily, starting with families and those needing additional time." He lowered the mic and met Ethan's eye. "Let's do this right." "Boarding families now," Ethan said into the PA, voice steadying as the words found their groove. On board, Captain Harper stepped into the cockpit, slid into her seat, and looked at her first officer. "We needed 5 extra minutes to do the right thing," she said, buckling in. "I'll take that trade." "Always," the FO said, flipping a switch. The cabin door closed with a mellow thump. The jet tug engaged. The aircraft eased back from the gate, the city tilting a fraction in the oval window. Aaliyah held the wings pin between her fingers, the note under her palm. She thought about how quickly power can move when it wants to, and how slow change can feel when it has to be built one conversation, one policy, one person at a time. She thought about her father standing in that Seattle boardroom, the rain turning the skyline to watercolor, and how his voice had cut through 1,000 miles like a clean line of ink. Her phone buzzed with a text. "Dad, proud of you. Breathe, make pictures, call when you land." She typed back, "Love you, will do." The plane taxied, paused, turned, and lined up with the runway center line, white stripes whirring past. Aaliyah pressed her head back against the seat and let the engine's rising note carry the last of the adrenaline out of her muscles. On takeoff, she looked out and caught a final glimpse of Gate 47 getting small, like a place in a story you leave and visit again only as a lesson. When the seatbelt sign pinged off 20 minutes later, the purser arrived with the ginger ale and the note. "From all of us," he said. "Thank you," she said, meaning the drink, the note, the effort, the unspoken. Thomas Grant waited until the cabin settled. Then he leaned forward from 3A, careful with his voice. "Ms. Morgan, Aaliyah, if this is the last thing you want to talk about, I'll respect that. If it isn't, I'd be honored to listen. Not as a story yet, as a person." She studied him. His eyes didn't have the bright hunger of someone chasing clicks. They had the gravity of someone who'd sat through other people's worst days and tried to hold them gently. "Not now," she said, "but later. Maybe." "Maybe works," he said, leaning back. "I'll be here." She turned her camera toward the aisle, then back to the window, then to her hands. The ginger ale bubbled quietly. The clouds opened into a bright blue shelf of sky. In Seattle, David Morgan walked back to the table and set his phone down. The room hadn't moved. He placed his palms on the glossy wood and looked at his team: legal, ops, HR, communications. "We'll address the incident immediately," he said. "Transparent, specific. We'll own it, and then we'll go deeper. We built this company to move people, not to measure who belongs. If there's rot, we cut it out and rebuild the beam." He wasn't performing, he was laying out the work. Heads nodded not because he was the CEO, though he was, but because the path he marked had room for integrity. "Draft me a statement in plain English," he added. "No euphemisms, and find Dr. Camille Price. If we're going to fix culture, I want the best help and the hard truths. Start today." Back at 30,000 feet, Aaliyah slid the wings pin onto the string of her camera as if to remind herself what had almost been taken from her and what hadn't been at all. She lifted the camera again, framed the horizon, and clicked. In the rectangle, the world looked level. That was the point of a horizon line. Not that everything was equal yet, but that you could tell when it was tilted and how to correct it. She sat back and let the engine's hum fill the quiet places. The chapter wasn't done. It had just reached the mountaintop turn where the road changes direction and the view widens. Somewhere below, Gate 47 returned to being a gate. Boarding groups called and barcodes beeped and families shuffled children forward with snacks and promises. But for one girl in 2A, and for a man 1,000 miles away with rain on his window, the world had clicked a notch toward better. Outside, the sun caught the wing and turned the metal bright. Inside, Aaliyah felt the light land on her face, and for the first time since the rip, she didn't feel it as heat. She felt it as clarity. The newsroom at the Boston Sentinel still hummed with the echo of the story that had detonated across the nation. Aaliyah Johnson's face, young, composed, and steady even in humiliation, had been on every screen, in every living room, for days. Outside the glass walls of Thomas Hargrove's office, reporters whispered in small knots, some still replaying the cell phone footage, others furiously scrolling through the flood of public statements and corporate apologies. Thomas sat at his desk, the weight of a decision pressing down on him like a millstone. The exclusive interview with Aaliyah had been more than a story. It had been a mirror held up to the country's face. And now, as senior editor, he knew the next step wasn't just about chasing headlines. It was about what came after the outrage. Across town, in a quiet brownstone apartment, Aaliyah sat cross-legged on her couch, her phone buzzing endlessly with notifications. Messages poured in, from strangers, from old classmates, from distant relatives she hadn't heard from in years. Some were words of love and solidarity. Others were raw confessions. This happened to me too. I wish I'd spoken up when it happened. She read them all. She responded when she could. But the noise of the world was loud, and inside she felt a strange stillness. She had done her part in telling the truth. Now the question was, what to do with the truth once it was out there? That afternoon, a knock at her door broke the quiet. When she opened it, Thomas stood there, his trench coat collar turned up against the late autumn chill. He held no notebook, no recorder, just a small cardboard box. "I brought you something," he said. Inside the box was an old Nikon F2 film camera, its leather strap worn smooth from decades of use. "It was my father's," Thomas explained, his voice low. He was a press photographer in the 70s, covered the Boston busing crisis. Said this camera taught him that you don't just take pictures, you bear witness. I thought, maybe it should be in the hands of someone who knows what to do with it. Aaliyah's fingers traced the cool metal of the camera body. For the first time in days, her eyes softened into something close to a smile. "You know I already have a camera," she said. "I know," Thomas replied. "But this one comes with a promise. From me. I'm not going to let this story fade into next week's archives. I'm going to make sure it leads to something real." They talked for hours that night. Not about the headline or the viral clips, but about the quieter truths. The small humiliations that never make the news, the way prejudice could hide in plain sight, and the courage it took to meet it head-on. Thomas asked if she would be willing to sit in on a private meeting with Horizon Air's interim leadership. Not for publicity, but to put her voice in the room where decisions were being made. Aaliyah hesitated. "They already know what happened." "They know the facts," Thomas said. "But they haven't heard the weight of it in your voice. That's different." 2 days later, in a sleek conference room overlooking the Charles River, the first seeds of Horizon Air's reform began to take root. The CEO's chair was empty. The interim board had convened to address the damage. Public trust had been gutted. Lawsuits loomed. And into that atmosphere walked Aaliyah, head high, camera hanging around her neck like a quiet talisman. The executives expected anger. They expected demands. What they got instead was clarity. "I don't need another apology," she told them. "I need you to understand that what happened to me wasn't a mistake. It was the result of a system you built and never fixed. And I need to know what you're going to build in its place." It was Thomas, seated off to the side, who watched their faces shift, some defensive, some pained, a few genuinely reflective. In the days that followed, Horizon Air announced a sweeping internal review, not the hollow kind. They brought in outside auditors, civil rights attorneys, and community advocates. Training was reimagined from the ground up, focusing on empathy rather than rote policy. Complaint channels were rebuilt to protect whistleblowers, and for the first time, the company published quarterly reports on bias-related incidents. And yet, for all the policy drafts and press releases, the most profound change happened far from the cameras. It was in the break rooms, where veteran staff began to check their own assumptions. In the boarding lines, where gate agents paused to meet a passenger's eyes before scanning a ticket. It was, Thomas thought, the slow work of turning a tide. One evening, weeks later, Thomas found himself back at Aaliyah's apartment. The Nikon F2 now sat on a side table, next to a stack of black and white prints she'd been developing in a community darkroom. "This one," she said, holding up a portrait of a Horizon flight attendant in full uniform. "She told me she almost quit last year because of the culture. Now she's mentoring 2 new hires through the company's diversity track. She says it feels different this time, like it's not just talk." Thomas studied the image. There was light in the woman's eyes, a light that hadn't been there in the headlines. "You're documenting the change," he said. "I'm documenting the people," Aaliyah corrected. "The change is just what happens when people stop being afraid to see each other." Thomas smiled, a rare, unguarded smile. Maybe that's the real story. And in that small apartment, with winter settling in over the city, it was clear to both of them the story wasn't ending. It was beginning to live in the hands of those willing to carry it forward. Snow was falling over Seattle, quiet and fine as sifted flour, when David Morgan stood at the podium in Horizon Air's headquarters. Behind him, the company's blue and silver logo gleamed under soft stage lights. Cameras from every major news outlet were trained on him, but his focus was on the rows of employees: pilots, mechanics, gate agents, flight attendants filling the auditorium. "This is not another PR campaign," he began. "This is a course correction." The room held still. No corporate slogans, no rehearsed laughter, only the sound of a man with authority making a promise in plain English. "We are launching what we're calling the Aaliyah Initiative, named not because of one incident, but because of what that incident revealed. We will train differently. We will hire differently, and we will listen differently. Our passengers trust us with their journeys. That means they should never have to prove they belong on our planes." Aaliyah sat 3 rows back, flanked by Thomas Grant and Captain Linda Harper. She hadn't wanted her name attached to a corporate program, but her father had been insistent, not to claim the spotlight, but to make sure the memory stayed sharp in the company's conscience. When David stepped away from the podium, Dr. Camille Price took his place. A tall woman with a voice that could command a courtroom, she didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Bias isn't an abstract problem," she said. "It's an everyday behavior that either gets corrected or gets comfortable, and comfort is the enemy of change." From that day forward, training sessions shifted from ticking boxes to telling stories. Employees didn't just memorize policy. They role-played scenarios, challenged each other's assumptions, and heard first-hand accounts from passengers who'd been profiled or dismissed. By spring, the effects were showing. The company's quarterly bias incident report, the first in its history, showed a 47% drop in complaints. Internal surveys revealed something even more important. Employees said they felt empowered to intervene when they saw misconduct. In one photograph Aaliyah took during a visit to LAX, Ethan Brooks stood behind the counter at Gate 47, speaking with a passenger in a wheelchair. His body leaned forward, eyes at the same level as the travelers. The smile wasn't customer service scripted. It was human. "That's what you wanted to see," Thomas said, studying the print over coffee. "That's what I wanted to feel," Aaliyah corrected. Months later, Horizon invited Aaliyah to speak at their annual leadership summit in Denver. She walked onto the stage in a simple navy dress, camera hanging like it always did, and looked out at an audience of executives, union leaders, and industry regulators. I was raised to believe that dignity is something you carry inside you, she began. But I've learned it's also something that can be taken away or restored by the people around you. Every person you meet is carrying a story you can't see. The question is whether you give them room to tell it or you write it for them. Her words weren't loud, but they carried. Even the people in the back stopped checking their phones. When she stepped off the stage, Captain Harper was waiting in the wings. "You ever think about becoming a pilot?" the captain asked with a half-smile. Aaliyah laughed. "I think I'm better behind a lens." "Doesn't matter where you stand," Harper said. "You just have to keep showing people the horizon." And for the first time since the day at Gate 47, Aaliyah realized her life wasn't just back on course. It was flying on a new heading entirely.